Hello, welcome. We are going to be starting in just a few moments. Appreciate you all making your time to be here. We're going to let some people give it just a minute or two to let people filter in, and then we will dive into our webinar. Until then, if you feel like you want to grab a drink, grab a snack, some of you, if you're having a late lunch, we highly welcome having a snack while you're learning about campaign finance. I can suggest nothing better. Nobody should learn about campaign finance on an empty stomach. So please do that, and we will get started in just one moment. All right. Thank you for any of those that have come since I spoke. We are going to go ahead and get started. If anybody joins us, if you have colleagues or other people working on your campaign that are joining us shortly, know that we'll have this all recorded. So don't worry, you're not going to miss anything. But first, I want to welcome you all and thank you. This is our first candidate workshop of 2026. So I really thank you for making the time to come and learn about this work. And we think it's important. Today, we will be talking about campaign finance. We'll be doing a campaign finance overview for those candidates that are specifically running in the Portland City election. So with that in mind, if we want to jump to the next slide, and then we'll do some introductions, and then I'm going to pass it off to my colleague to get some context for you all. So my name is James Eccles. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the city's elections education supervisor. It basically means that I oversee voter education and engagement, and that includes our education programs for candidates like you or people working on campaigns, if that may be the case. So we have this program basically so we can try and help you all have a better understanding of the rules, the regulations, and all of the filings that you might need to do as a candidate as you're navigating the system. Today, I'll be talking, you'll be coming back to me when we talk about our campaign finance specifics, contribution limits, and our disclosure requirements. But for now, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Blanca to introduce herself and speak to you about why we're here.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Blanca Gaitan Farfan, she, her pronouns. I'm the Elections and Community Education Analyst. So thanks for joining us today. Next slide, please. So during our time today, here is the brief overview of the agenda. We'll be doing a short introduction to Portland City elections, background on Portland campaign finance requirements. Most of the content will cover contribution limits and disclosure requirements. We'll also provide some tips, resources, and do question and answer time at the end of the session. Next slide. Some housekeeping as we get started. This session will be recorded and the recording will be posted to the City Elections website. Some Zoom features to keep in mind. There are closed captioning option available if you want to turn that on. Most of the questions, we encourage you to utilize the Q&A feature. We'll be accepting the questions that way. And if we do not get all of the questions answered during our time today, don't worry, you can feel free to reach out to City Elections directly via email and we are happy to help. We also have the campaign finance guide available now. It's posted on the City Elections website, and we will also include it in one of the links here shortly. And lastly, we want to do a reminder that today's session is not intended to be legal advice and we cannot answer legal questions. This session is primarily for educational purposes. And next slide, please. So briefly, Portland City Elections is a division of the City Auditor's Office. The City Auditor's Office ensures an open and accountable government. We ensure and oversee city elections, certify city candidates and measures to the ballot, and certify city election results. We also enforce city campaign finance and lobbying regulations, as well as conduct voter education. So that's the work that we do and who we are as Portland City Elections. Separately, you may hear other offices or divisions that do elections related work, including small donor elections, Multnomah County elections, and the Oregon Secretary of State elections divisions. These are all different entities that are also elections related, but separate from the City of Portland elections. Next slide. Briefly, some context on, how we got here to Portland's campaign finance requirements. So voters approved a ballot measure, which resulted in amendments to the city charter. So now campaign finance regulations are included in city code and administrative rule, as you see on the screen. If you'd like to learn more about the history and the details, we will also put a link in the chat that you can reference for more of that background. Portland City Elections is responsible for education and enforcement of campaign finance for the city. So we are hosting this webinar to support potential candidates, staff, volunteers on campaigns, as well as others who simply want to learn more about campaign finance. Our goal is to really provide the information that folks may need ahead of launching a campaign, or as you're thinking about running for office. We want to provide with the information that is necessary so that we can avoid situations where campaigns or candidates have complaints filed against them or violations issued. So that is the overview of why we're here today and what you can expect to cover. I will now pass it off to James as we dive into the main topics for today's session.
Thank you so much, Blanca. So as I said at the beginning, I'm going to cover two major portions of campaign finance in the city of Portland, and that's going to be contribution limits and the disclosure requirements, or the paid for by type communications. We're going to start off by talking about contribution limits. I want to preface all of this by saying, this is educational and it is meant to be more of a high level kind of a primer for people to get into the information and make sure to highlight things they really need to know. We cannot possibly cover every detail of campaign finance, but we highly encourage you to check out our campaign finance guide. It has lots of the information that I will only touch on in this presentation, and it is a great resource for you to reference throughout your campaign to make sure that you're following all the rules that you need to. So let's start off with contribution limits, or effectively how much people and committees can give to you. All right, so moving into the next slide. The first question you might have is, what are contributions? This might seem pretty intuitive, and in some parts it is. If anybody's offering to give you cash or a currency of any kind, so cash, checks, transferring it over a card or a portal online, all of that, that counts as a cash contribution. There are also things known as in-kind contributions that may or may not impact your campaign. That's effectively anything that's not a cash contribution. So things like goods or services, or something that's given to you where the value is equal to the fair market value. Both of these things count as contributions under our law, and you should keep that in mind as you're thinking about the limits that are imposed. Going forward. The following are the sources that a candidate can receive money from, and the limits when it comes from those sources. So to start off, the place where most people are getting their money is either from individuals or political committees. And for Portland City elections, that limit is $613 per individual or per political committee. So that means you can't get more than $613 in an election cycle. An election cycle is going to be defined the same for all of you do in this election year, and it's everything from the last election in 2024, November 5th, 2024, to the next election in November of 2026. So in the future, it's that election cycle may change a little bit because it's generally going to be the time they're running. But for now, everybody ran for office at the same time in 2024. So the election cycle is a little bit easier because it'll be the same for everybody. Okay. The next source is from yourself. So you certainly are allowed to give to your own campaign or to spend money on your own material. That's called just self-funding, and there is no limit to that. There's no limits on what you yourself can spend on your campaign. Feel free to spend as much as you'd like. The last one for city elections candidates is a small donor committee. This is a specific type of committee that is defined as a committee that has never accepted contributions except from individuals and limited to $100 per individual per calendar year. So it's up there. It's a very specific definition, but if a committee falls under that definition and does count as a small donor committee, then in that case, there's no limit to the amount that they can contribute to your campaign, but only if they fall under this very specific definition. Now, these are the three sources, really the four sources and the limits for Portland City elections and for city regulation. However, we're going to, several times throughout this presentation, we're going to mention a program called Small Donor Elections. They have some separate policies, some separate rules, some separate code. So we highly recommend that you reference that and look to that because there are going to be some other rules and some other limits that they have that are separate from our own. I'll come back to talk a little bit more about small donor elections in the future, but for now, that's good to keep in mind when thinking about limits. The last thing I want to cover on this slide is one small but important note to make when discussing contribution limits, and that's that both the person giving the money and the candidate receiving the money are responsible for staying under the limit. That means that the constituents who you are asking to make donations also need to know how much they are allowed to give, or they might be in danger of a violation of their own. So that's important to keep in mind and something some people don't always know when they're thinking about campaigning. All right, moving forward. Unlike in some jurisdictions, you will not typically be submitting your reports on contributions and expenditures directly to Portland City Elections. Instead, all city candidates will utilize the state platform known as ORSTAR, or Oregon Elections System for Tracking and Reporting. This is a portal and a database that allows you to sign up as a candidate and then submit all your transaction reports. City Elections does not run ORSTAR, so when you look into first utilizing the platform, you should reach out to the Secretary of State's office with any questions that you might have. Importantly, they also offer trainings, and you can find out more about that online. And I believe we'll be able to link the website to Secretary of State and ORSTAR in chat for you all to look at. Okay, next slide. A natural question that follows is, when do I need to worry about filing transactions on ORSTAR and officially becoming a candidate committee? That is a great question. I will again make it clear that when you become a candidate committee, you will file that paperwork directly with the state, and I recommend you review their manuals and reach out directly to them if you have additional questions regarding that filing. I also want to take a moment here to note that filing to create a candidate committee is not the same process as filing to be on the Portland City ballot. The first one is done through the state and relates to filing campaign finance documents and transactions, while filing to be on the ballot is done directly with the city elections office and opens on June 3rd. If you want to learn more about the second type of filing, the one with Portland City Elections, I highly recommend you attend our training in 2 weeks on May 28th, which will delve specifically into how to file to be on the ballot. Okay, going back to the candidate committee run by the state and ORSTAR. Generally, you will need to file the paperwork to create your committee either 3 days after your first contribution or expenditure, or no later than the last day to file to be on the Portland City ballot, which is either August 18th for incumbent candidates or August 25th for all other candidates. Now, your deadline for when you should create this committee is whichever of these two comes first for you. So it may be different. And again, if you're unsure, always follow up with the Secretary of State's office. Some candidates may not need to create a candidate committee at all. And that is true if all of the following exceptions are true for you. Not just one of them, but all three of these must be true for you. So first, You have to serve as your own treasurer, so you haven't hired someone else or have an outside organization being your treasurer. You have to have no existing candidate committee, either current or sort of held over from previous election, no currently existing candidate committee. And finally, you have to be currently under the $1,500 threshold and not plan to go over that threshold in a calendar year. So they have a separate threshold that is not tied to the election cycle, but is tied to each calendar year. And if all three of these things are true, then you are not necessarily required to file a candidate committee. And what I do want to note here is sometimes these things won't be true initially, but can become true at some point in your campaign. And if that is true, you may then become required to. So you always want to keep track of that stuff and follow up with Secretary of State if you're unsure. Okay, next slide. Now, you've heard us mention the Small Donor Elections Program a few times, and I want to clarify some things about that program. If you're not aware, they are the city's public financing program, and I highly recommend you check them out. However, to clarify, they are a separate and independent program from Portland City Elections. We're housed in the auditor's office. The Small Donor Elections Program is not housed in the auditor's office and is a separate and independent program. They have their own section of city code and they have their own set of administrative rules. So if you're going to participate in that program, I highly recommend you become familiar with those separately from anything we talk about here today. The next thing I want to note is that there is often overlapping city elections and small donor elections regulations. We both have contribution limits, and there are some things that might seem very similar, but there is some nuance there. It's entirely possible to violate one regulation from one of those programs and not the other, or to violate regulations from both of those programs at the same time. So you always want to make sure, don't just check one set, make sure you're checking both programs and to make sure that you're within the requirements of both of those programs. The next thing about small donor elections is that there are some campaign finance definitions that differ. So you're not ever going to want to assume that because you read about that definition in our material or city elections material that now you know what it means. Some of examples of this is election cycles defined differently, in-kind contributions, and small donor committees. These are all things that are defined somewhat differently in small donor elections than they're defined by Portland City elections. So you're going to want to make sure to double check those things so that you know what's going on, you're ahead of the game. And then finally, and this is probably the most important thing I want to say about small donor elections, is that all city candidates, whether or not you're participating in small donor elections or not, are subject to the same city communication disclosure laws. So never assume that because you start to participate in small donor elections that you now are outside of the rules and regulations of Portland City elections and that are in the election code. You always want to make sure to double check that stuff. And if you're ever unsure, reach out and ask. All right. Don't think that because you jumped into one program that now you can ignore the rules of the other program. All right. There you move forward. So now I want to dive into disclosure requirements. We can feel free, if you haven't already been, to ask questions about contribution limits, and we can come back and address any of those at the end, or if they're answered by our experts in chat, that'll be great. But now I want to talk about disclosure requirements. So basically, a disclosure requirement is what you typically see in a lot of political ads where it says paid for by, and it has some sort of communication there. Different places have different requirements, and these requirements are what are set out for all Portland City candidates. I want to say that again, all Portland City candidates. So if you were showing up on the ballot and you were running for office for a Portland City office, you absolutely are held by these disclosure requirements, and you're going to want to make sure that you know what they are. Okay, move forward. So generally, what are disclosures? So disclosures are this message. You see an example here of that paid for by. Now, the most simple form is the simply paid for by. In our example here, we have our candidate, Harmony Candido, and this is at the top. We can see that it's paid for by the Friends of Harmony Candido, which is just that candidate's own political committee. That's their candidate committee. So most commonly, you're going to see that's all that's going to be required, but over the next several slides, I'm going to go into the details of when additional disclosures that you might see here are also required. And again, just like with contribution limits, this is going to be pretty high level for disclosure requirements. So anything here that we're touching on, if you want to know more about it, I highly recommend looking at the Campaign Finance Manual guide. Okay, the one other thing I'll say before we dive into details is you should just, as a rule of thumb, and what's stated in the law is these disclosures have to be prominently displayed and they must be easily comprehensible to a person with average reading, vision, and hearing faculties. So although this might seem like a kind of a broad definition, really you can always kind of do a check on, and you should always do a check on yourself of if you're putting this together and and you have trouble reading it, or you have to squint, or it doesn't quite show up, or it doesn't make sense, then maybe that might be your first sign that it might not meet some of the requirements, and you might want to try and make it a little more readable. Okay, next slide. Now, a disclosure is not always required. Not all communications or all material that you create is going to have a disclosure. So first of all, anything that costs you less than $250 to create is exempt from disclosure requirements. Now, create is defined pretty broadly in our rules and our code. So you're going to want to double check on that, because sometimes you might think that, well, I didn't create this thing. I just paid to have it show up on TV, something like that. You're going to want to double check those requirements of what exactly it means to create something under this rule. But anytime that you pay $250 or more, then you will have to have disclosure. If it's something that you did that was really cheap or free for you to put out there, then you don't necessarily have to have a disclosure. There are also several types of items that are exempt from requiring a disclosure. Some of these are listed here, such as small items like an ink pen with your name on it, or bumper stickers, or smaller signs. And there are some additional exceptions that sort of fall into this category. So I would encourage you to take a look at this section in the Campaign Finance Guide for a fuller list of what sort of things are exempt. But mostly it falls under these types of items where it really would be difficult to have that full disclosure showing up on that item. Okay, next slide. Another requirement, as I stated at the beginning, is that you're required to prominently display your disclosure message. But the exact meaning of prominently changes a bit depending on the type of communication. So there are different types of communications that you're going to be creating throughout your campaign, or that you have the option to create throughout your campaign. Some of these might be printed materials, websites, large billboards or signs, videos, and audio communications. All of these have slightly different rules, and you should, as always, check the guide before creating them. But I will go over a few examples for you here so you can kind of get a sense of what we mean when we talk about prominently displayed. Next slide. So for printed materials like pamphlets or on websites, as shown here, you'll want the font to be in a color that contrasts from the background, and the font must be at least the same size as the majority of the rest of the text. So as you can see in our examples here, the candidate decided to make totally sure that it would be contrasting. So they have this black text on a white background where the disclosure shows up, and they made sure that the font there generally matches the font that is in the other parts. What you don't want to do is have it blend in, or have font that is so tiny and small that it's much smaller than the rest of the font and it can barely be read. Those are things you for sure want to avoid. There's one additional thing to keep in mind for digital platforms, but I'll come back to that in just a second. The last example on here, for something like video, you need to make sure that the disclosure is visible on the screen for at least 4 seconds, and closed captioning does not fulfill your requirement for this. So whatever your disclosure is, whatever it's determined to be, it needs to show up on that screen for 4 seconds. And even if someone turns on closed captioning and you read it out loud and that closed caption shows up, note that that doesn't meet your requirement. You still have to have it visually displayed in writing up on the screen for at least 4 seconds. Okay, next slide. Now, as I said, going back to digital communications, we understand that with some smaller communications like social media posts, it can be difficult to fit the entire disclosure in such a small post, especially if someone is reading it on a mobile phone, a smartphone, that sort of thing. For that, we have an alternative in our rules, and that is if your communication is limited to 1,000 characters or less, or the intended disclosure would take up 40% or more of the message space, then you can use this alternative method of disclosure. All right. Now, this still requires you to have the paid for by message. So you'll still have that paid for by message on the actual communication itself. but the full disclosure can then be linked to on a separate active web page. So basically, as you'll see here in the example, it's a little small, but it's easier to read in our campaign finance guide if you want to check that out. But in this small example, you could see that it says this message was paid for by Friends of Harmony Candido. For full disclosure, visit, and then it gives the URL of where the entire disclosure will show up. So that can make it a little bit easier to create content on digital platforms without it feeling like your whole space is taken up by this disclosure. Okay, next slide. As we all know, sometimes information changes, so it's important that you keep the information included in these disclosures up to date. For different types of communications, there will be different timeliness requirements. This basically means how far out of date the information can get before you can get into trouble. I recommend looking into the guide for each of these: audio, video, digital, other electronic communications. Even though they all have a basic 5-day timeliness requirement, that's 5 business days, there are nuances for each. So I recommend that you take a look at exactly when that 5 days starts, and that information's in the campaign finance guide. For printed material, the requirement is that your disclosure must be current within 10 business days of the printing date of that material. This means that you don't have to constantly be paying to update material every time something changes, but you want to make sure that when you initially print that material and you pay for it to have printed and that message goes on there, that it's up to date at that point and it's current. All right. Here we have an example again of a printed material with this information on here. And the assumption is whenever this was printed and to be sent out, that all of this information was current within 10 days. All right, next slide. All right, we have talked about all of these disclosures, but what the heck do you actually need to include on them? That's kind of important information. Often, as I said before, all you really will need is the first item here, or what is often referred to as the paid for by message, and that is just whoever paid to provide or present the communication. Now remember, this is only for communications costing at least $250. So if you paid for it yourself, that might be your own committee or your own name in that example, in that message, as we saw with our previous example. If someone else paid for it and did this as part of a contribution to your campaign, then you might have them listed. In some cases, you may also need to list your top contributors, referred to as dominant contributors in our regulations. And if you are required to list that, you may also need to list the types of businesses for that contributor and their top funders. So these are not always required. In fact, in most cases, for most candidates, they're not going to be required. However, if they are, these are effectively the individuals or committees that gave the most to your campaign. Those will need to, regardless of whether they were involved in this specific communication, they will need to be listed out. And the business type that they are, and then the top funders to them. Each of those have nuance for when they are or are not included. So again, as I've said multiple times, you're going to want to check the campaign finance guide for the exact times when that is or is not required. Okay, I'll walk through an example so that you can see how these might be properly disclosed. But again, check the guide as you're making the communications, because that's going to help you finding out what is required for whatever your specific case is, because you may not match the example that we're going to go over. All right, next slide. So in this example, we have a billboard created by a candidate who apparently loves Portland. That's good. And is participating in small donor elections. All right. These are the important things that we want to know about our candidate here as they create this board. Now, it appears that they may have received an in-kind contribution large enough to require listing a dominant contributor. So let's walk through each piece of this disclosure. All right, next slide. The first thing we see here is the message that we talked about that's generally going to be there, the paid for by Friends of Harmony Candido. So it looks like this candidate paid for it with their own committee, and that money came out and they covered that message on here. All right, the next part. Next slide. Thank you. So we see that they, as I mentioned, may have had a large in-kind contribution. So they needed to list a dominant contributor. In this case, their dominant contributor is Keep Portland Wild. All right. Since they had to list a dominant contributor, they needed to list the type of business. So as we go to the next slide, we can see in parentheses next, they listed it as an environment, conservation, and wildlife organization. Now, this type of business there's more details on this process in the campaign finance guide, but effectively these are things that are listed. This is going to be the same for everybody. So everybody that gets information from Keep Portland Wild, they're going to look this information up based on a business code, and they're going to find that Environment Conservation and Wildlife Organization is what this business falls under. All right. And then the final portion of this is the top funders. So these are the top funders to that organization, Keep Portland Wild. And it looks like their top funders are What's the Buzz Apiculture Services, Put a Bird on It, and United Urban Gardens, or UG for short. So these are the top 3 funders for Keep Portland Wild. Keep Portland Wild is the top dominant contributor for Friends of Harmony Candido, and Harmony Candido is the individual campaign committee that paid for this billboard. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So this ends our section on disclosure requirements. But before I hand it back to my colleague Blanca, I want to go over several tips that we think may help you avoid or fix mistakes before you get into trouble. We're always about preventing getting into trouble rather than waiting till you make a mistake and then, trying to bail you out. We want to prevent mistakes, not fix them later. Okay. So the first thing here is refunds. Contributions returned or refunded within 14 calendar days will not be counted toward contribution limits by the Portland City Elections. So this essentially means that if you get given a contribution from somebody that goes over that limit, don't panic. If you get that contribution, you can just make sure to give it back within that 14 calendar days. And as long as all the reporting structures in place and you show that, then you're totally fine. You don't have to worry. We're not going to go back and say you had that money in your pocket for one day and try and get you. You got 14 days to fix it. Okay. Small donor elections and Secretary of State also have windows to cure mistakes. So I recommend familiarizing yourself with those as well if you're participating in the Small Donor Elections Program. And for anybody that's participating in state, if you get that ORSTAR training, you're going to learn more about how to fix things on ORSTAR. All right. Next, we always recommend rechecking contributor information to make sure it's current before sending out a new communication. Sometimes this information may change without you even realizing it. So whenever you're writing up those disclosures, you always want to double check that everything on there is the same, that your dominant contributors didn't change, or that their funders haven't changed, and make sure that all that information is as current as it can be. All right. After that is government sources of funding. And we just want to note that sources of funding from the government do not need to be included as a dominant contributor. This comes up every now and then. So you just want to keep in mind that if you do have a large source of funding, that doesn't automatically require you to have that longer disclosure. Finally, on this slide, since both you and those giving you money are liable for going over a contribution limit, it might be a good idea to include a disclaimer with the actual limit when you're soliciting funds. It kind of helps keep people on your good side if you let them know what they're liable for and just make sure they know what the limits are. A lot of average voters may not be aware of all the rules and regulations, certainly not to the same extent that you might be if you're working on a campaign. So it's always good to have that kind of a disclaimer just to make sure that they don't get in trouble and you don't get in trouble. All right, next slide. The next one is to hopefully avoid confusion if you really dive deep into campaign finance law. I know some people that are working on campaigns or running for office really want to get to all the bottom of the rules and get familiar with them. So you may go back and read the actual charter itself. And it's important to know that some of these things are actually unenforced portions of the charter. So due to various court rulings, certain parts of city charter are not enforced by our office. This includes sections on expenditure limits, limits on a candidate funding their own campaign, and the enforcement provisions are governed by city code and administrative rule and not by what's in the city charter. Those all come down because of various court rulings. Certain things are found to be unconstitutional. It's not very easy to change the charter. That has to go back to the people for a vote. So since we can't easily change the charter, but we still have to follow those court rulings, we sort of just leave them as unenforced parts of the charter and we fix it in code and administrative rule. But it's something good to keep in mind so you don't get confused. All right, we love the idea of people working together, but officially there is no such thing as a candidate slate when it comes to filing to be on the ballot. You can only file to be on the ballot as an individual, and you can only file an ORSTAR as an individual candidate, as a single candidate committee, and you are individually responsible for campaign finance regulations. This means that you should be particularly aware of how to structure your disclosures and how you're splitting the costs if you do decide to work together with another candidate. There's a whole section in our campaign finance guide on this. It's often referred to as slates, and I recommend giving it a read. It's something that, it's great to work together and we encourage, but it changes the rules a little bit. The way you interact with the rules might be a little bit different. So you want to be extra careful when you're doing that to make sure you understand how you're putting everything together and structuring those disclosures. Okay. Finally, please reach out to us and other offices early. You should always contact us or Small Donor Elections or the state as soon as you know there might be an issue. And all of these offices have trainings available for you that we highly recommend. As I noted earlier, City Elections will be doing another webinar like this in 2 weeks on May 28th that will focus specifically on how to file to be on the Portland City ballot. So we highly encourage you to be a part of that webinar, to join and ask additional questions if you or someone that you know is running for office. And until then, again, all of these trainings are great. So we highly recommend you take part in trainings of other offices and reach out with questions. Okay, with that, I'm going to hand it back over to my colleague Blanca, and I hope at least some of you are still awake for what she has for you.
Thanks, James. Yes, we're very close to wrapping up here. The last few slides are all about just a quick review of the critical information that James just provided, as well as some links and resources. So next slide. So just to reiterate, Small Donor Elections has its own separate set of regulations that is outside of our office. So we encourage you to contact the Small Donor Elections staff for more information about their program, trainings available, deadlines, all those sorts of things. Contribution limits, again, that $613 is the limit for individuals or political committees. Disclosure requirements in general, any communication supporting or opposing a City of Portland candidate costing $250 or more to create must include certain disclosures. Again, different types of campaign communications have different disclosure timelines, and we encourage you to review the campaign finance guide for more information on the specific deadlines for those. And City Elections, as staff, we are here to help you. We really encourage everyone to attend the additional trainings, this training as well. Once we get it up on the website, feel free to review the guide as well for more information, and then reach out to us with specific questions that you may have at any time via email. And next slide. So lastly, to close out, we included some links for resources in the chat already, but this next slide here will have just briefly outline what resources we have available from our office, which includes the campaign finance guide. You'll find a PDF version available that you can download. The City Elections website has more information in detail as well about campaign finance, and our email being elections@portlandoregon.gov. And those are specific to us again as Portland City Elections. On the next slide, you will find other resources that are available, including the Small Donor Elections website, the Campaign Finance Manual for the state, as well as the Secretary of State website. So those will be there on the screen as well as in the chat, and they are also included in the Campaign Finance Manual if you lose the link or come across any issue like that. But that concludes the content overall for this portion of the webinar, and I'll pass it back to James.